Hey, as promised, Mr. Ray Brown, and I want to touch on the very first exercise. And before I maybe get to that, one of the things he says in his very short introduction is never stop practicing. It's the last thing I want to emphasize: never stop practicing. And so I think there's something to be said about repetition and getting muscle memory, and the only way to do that is, I think, with repetition. And I don't think it has to take like multiple hours per day, but I think a consistent frequency of practice, even if it's 30 minutes every 2 days. It'd be better if you could. I would argue it's probably better to play 15 minutes every day than 30 minutes every 2 days or an hour once a week, because I think there's something to be said about coming back again and again and again. Anyways, I'm sure there's lots of opinions on that. That's just my experience. I need to kind of just apply as many repetitions as possible before I start to really build a proper habit where I don't actually have to think about it. So first exercise in the Ray Brown book. What a cool dude. What a stylish. Look at this guy's suit. So yeah, he says, let's go through and learn all your scales. Memorize them. And what's interesting about this very first one, and it's pretty unique, I think, in the book, because it's the only one where he suggests fingering. You can see there's little numbers and what string to play these things on throughout the book. Those fingering suggestions become more and more sparse the further you get, to the point where it's like you just don't even see them until there's like a really tricky situation where he suggests something, and I think that's important. He does this to make you think and make you try out different variations. But this first one, he suggests them all. So after I went through this, and it took me a good couple weeks, I'd say, to get these down and memorize them. And I think it took as long as it did was because it was still really new, and I was trying to learn how to shift, and I was trying to understand like the rationale behind some of the fingering choices. And so what I think you'll see when you start going through this, you'll start noticing things, coming from the electric bass world. You'll notice, there's a lot more shifting involved. Typical in position major scale for electric bass, you don't have to do any shifts. On an upright in the lower registers, you've got to shift 1, 2, like I think two times per. You'll see, depending on the scale and where he suggests putting it, there's a handful of shifts at times. And so there's three main things I notice after going through this. A pattern that emerges that you can start to apply to figuring out how to approach different fingerings according to like what Ray Brown is kind of like suggesting between the lines here. And that is, you'll notice that one, as much as possible, he tries to minimize the number of shifts he has to make. And at the same time, he tends to utilize like the open string as much as possible. Again, I think for a couple of reasons. One, I think there's a tone choice there. Two, I think that it's a way of like minimizing a shift. If he can play an open string without having to shift, there's an economy there. The other thing you'll notice is the shifting distances. He'll do his best to minimize the distance that you have to make in a shift. So for example, if I was going to play C minor, Ray Brown would Ray Brown would, C minor is a bad example because he would use that open string. He would suggest C, open, but for argument's sake, if he wanted to play those all on the same string, the Ray Brown approach would suggest playing C with the index, shifting a half step and playing the second and then the third using your pinky. So you'll notice this when he shifts, he's doing his best to shrink the distance, and also I can't remember if I mentioned this or not. He'll tend to space out necessary shifts so that you don't have passages where you have, you're in a position, you can play a couple notes and then you have to shift and then shift again immediately after. So you'll tend to try to get at least 2 notes out of each position. So maybe you notice the same thing, but it's interesting because he doesn't spoon feed you everything throughout the book. So I noticed that, and I think that's valuable when it comes to playing something like the electric bass, the upright bass, in that you're trying as best as possible to minimize shifts, which I think are an introduction to getting out of tune. They're a risk point for landing out of tune notes if your shift isn't on, and 2, it's a energy saving. So yeah, I just want to show a couple of examples, and maybe you can see what I'm talking about here. I'm gonna play. So I'll do the first one, the E major, and here's a perfect example of how he tends to prefer open strings if they're available to him. E, so E, open, index, 4, open, index, 4, shift to the 1, 2, and I'm pitchy there, I can tell. A little flat. And I just assume the descending is going to borrow the same fingering. One thing I want to add to this is what's going on with the thumb in these shifts. And for me, in that example there, I tend to leave my thumb in position. That's something I do on the electric bass all the time. But he doesn't suggest anything. I'm experimenting with it. Is that better, or is it better just to kind of leave them? And I'm finding that I don't know, I haven't built my preference yet, but it's something to consider. There's a French guy named Rabath, you probably heard of, and he promotes using that methodology for some shifts, and it allows him to use the thumb to really explore quite a large range if he needs to quickly. But that's beyond this. Just something to consider though. You may want to, if you're doing just like a semitone shift there, you may just want to leave your thumb anchored where it is, so as a reference point to where you come back to. So anyways, I'm going to play one more and then I'm going to shut this down. Here's an interesting one where this idea of minimizing shift distances and spacing out the shifts really is well illustrated. And this is the A flat fingering he suggests. And so for A flat, he suggests starting with your 4, shifting back. See, I'm actually pivoting off that thumb there. I just pivoted back. Let's do that again here. So it's 4 to the 1, a shift to the 2. That was just a half step shift. 4, shift back, index, 4, open, do I go a shift, or do I go it's hard to say, but he doesn't illustrate the descending patterns. But I think that principle applies, you know, like minimize the shifting distance, space out the shifts to try to get try to plant your, you know, if you're going to shift, try to get as many notes out of that position before you have to shift again. So there's a couple of like, you know, like strategies he applies, you know, to identifying the best fingerings, the most efficient fingerings. Anyways, that's all I want. There's, you know, he goes through this, every single one. Gets challenging when you start getting up to, you know, the D flat, you know, and up to like the E flat, because we're dealing with, you know, at least like 2 shifts, and they're some of these steps are going to be your first giant steps. So it's, I mean, you'll see. But bear in mind those patterns that I noticed in rationalizing the finger choices he suggests here. All right, as usual, kick me's and comments and any other notes, maybe other takeaways, other people who have gone through this, or things they've learned from their teachers on, you know, philosophy on basically shifting, if you will. All right, enjoy.